Hey everyone, and welcome back to another mining chamber video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build a mining rig. I'll give you a full commentary on it and what's going through my mind when I'm building it, as well as the steps that you should follow. So now let's go ahead and get into the video right after the intro. Now in this video, I'm going to be building a 12 GPU mining rig. Now I won't be talking about the profits and the costs of this mining rig because I do have different videos that I do that in, and this one will just be acting as a guide for you to build a rig. Now if you want to check out the builds where I talk about the profits and how much it costed me to buy them, then you can feel free to check out our mining rig builds playlist. Now all the parts in this video came from two mining rigs that I previously had, so the GPUs that I will be using in this video came from two different rigs. I didn't buy them recently, I've had them for over a year, so I made a video on both of those rigs. The first one is the 5700 XT, 6 of them, and then the second one is the RX 580s. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be putting all these 12 cards in just one mining rig, and then we'll be running off of one motherboard and CPU. Now if you're still struggling with the parts and you don't have all your parts yet, and you want to know about the compatibilities and which GPUs are best for mining, then I highly suggest watching the buying strategy guide that I've released before. That should be the first step, and then this video will be your second step. So if you watch that first, you'll have a better idea of what's going on. Now I will leave the link for that in the descriptions below. So now let's go ahead and jump into this build. After you have successfully collected all the parts and possibly lost a kidney or two in return for some GPUs, you want to make sure that you have the proper environment and knowledge for building your rig or just touching the electronics in general. If you build your rig on a carpet, you have a high chance of discharging static that can fry some of your parts, so it is recommended to avoid carpet and build on a hard surface. You can also ground yourself to remain on the safe side, and I will leave an article for that in the descriptions below that shows multiple ways to do it in a very simple manner. After you got your environment all set up, make sure that you don't touch the components from the no-no zones. So avoid touching the gold tips so you don't get dirt or oil on them, and carefully move around the hardware. They are not so fragile, but they are to be handled with care. Now in this build, there will be some special things that won't apply for everyone, but generally the instructions are the same and they can be repurposed for whatever rig you're building. Now let me explain why. In this build, I will be using a AAAWave frame that they sent to me. It's a 12 GPU frame, so you might have a different frame or you might have built your own, but I will be reviewing the AAAWave frame and I will be giving you guys my opinion on it as soon as we build it. There will also be a promotion code for it in the descriptions below, so feel free to grab one if they have it in stock. Now other than the frame, there is also the server power supply. Most of you guys might be using an ATX power supply, but I will be using a server power supply that was sent to me from ParallelMiner. I will give you guys my feedback on that as well once we get to that part. Maybe it will make you consider a server power supply. Now that is the two factors that might be different for you. Other than that, how many GPUs you plan to build, either 1 to 10, it does not matter as long as your motherboard has enough PCIe slots and your power supply has enough power. I will also be jumping into details on how you wire your cards and how to do the calculation for all the pins that you need. So now that we covered what you need to know before getting started, we can go ahead and start the build. Please make sure to watch this video fully to understand everything together. My first step is building out the frame of your rig. So in this case, we are using the AAAWave 12 GPU frame. The instructions for building it are good, but they might be a little confusing since they don't show clearly the orientation of the base. But it is a super easy frame to build and it does not take much time to assemble it at all. The build quality is really nice, edges are not sharp so you most likely won't scratch yourself on it, and my favorite thing about it is that it's small factor and it's super light even though it holds 12 GPUs. The feet has rubber padding as well, which is really useful, and it fits 2 ATX power supplies or 2 single server power supplies. But unfortunately it did not fit the 2400 watt power supply that we got from ParallelMiner, but we will go more on that later on once we reach that part. So like I mentioned, you will find this frame in the descriptions below, and if the page does not exist, then it's most likely sold out. They are disappearing in an instant, but AAAWave.com should be refilling their inventory the week this video is being posted. So check on there regularly and try to secure yours. Now after you have your frame built, the next step I like to take is getting your motherboard set up with your processor and RAM before placing it into the frame, so like that it's easier to access. So the first thing, you want to go ahead and take out your motherboard from the box, and then you want to install your CPU in it. Installing your CPU is very straightforward. You just want to pull on that lever that's next to the CPU socket. You can keep the black lid on it until you install the CPU, it will automatically pop off, and then just carefully grab your CPU and make sure that you align the two little dots as well as the arrow with the socket itself. It should simply just fall into the socket without any pressure or anything, and then you let the metal bracket fall back on it, and then from there slide the lever back into place. The black cover should pop off by itself, and then you're good to go. Now these instructions are specific for some of the Intel CPUs, but generally it's all the same concept. If you're using an AMD CPU, they will look a bit different, but it's still the same concept of putting them together. If you're still confused, you can always look up a guide specific for your CPU, and then you'll be good to go. Now once you have your CPU installed, you can go ahead and put some thermal paste on the CPU. Now if you have a brand new CPU and it came with a stock cooler, then you don't need to put any thermal paste because it's already applied on the CPU fan. But if you don't have any thermal paste applied to your cooler already, then you can go ahead and use an Arctic MX4 thermal paste that you can buy on Amazon for pretty cheap. It's a pretty good thermal paste, but you don't need to overthink it there because your CPU will not be getting hot at all. Now you just need to put a little bit there, just a little dot on it, and then you can place your fan on it. And having a stock cooler is completely fine because again, you're not going to be using your CPU, you're only going to be GPU mining in this case. If you do plan on CPU mining, that will be different for you, but we will cover that in a different video. Now for the CPU fan, you want to make sure to plug it in the right port, so you should see 4 pins on your motherboard that say CPU fan on it. If you plug it into the 4 wrong pins, your BIOS might halt and then you'll have to manually press continue. So it can be pretty annoying, so make sure that you plug it into the proper CPU fan pins. Now after you have your CPU and your CPU fan all done, you want to go ahead and move on to your RAM. Your RAM, you should have either 2 slots or 4 slots on your motherboard. Now if you're on 4 slots, usually you want to fill in your second and your 4th slot first, and if you have 2 slots, then you can fill in the first slot first. You can make sure by referring to your manual on your motherboard, and also make sure that your RAM is compatible by checking the buying guide that I have in the descriptions below. And inserting your RAM into the motherboard is very straightforward. First you want to open up the latches on the side. Sometimes there's a double latch, so you have a latch on each end, or sometimes you have a latch on only one end. So just unlock that latch and then align the little notch in the RAM stick, and then from there you just want to slide it into the slot and then add some pressure until it clicks in position. The little clip should automatically clip back to it, and then from there it will be all good. So now you have your motherboard all ready, you can go ahead and place it into your frame. So in this case, with the AAAWave frame, we're going to be putting these risers on the frame itself so that it keeps the motherboard from touching the metal frame. Now if you're building your own frame or you don't have a way around this, you can just go ahead and put your cardboard box for your motherboard below the motherboard as well, and that's completely fine. So just make sure that you secure it properly and your motherboard is all set. From there, you can move on to your next parts, which usually I start with the SSD. So now you can ignore the power supply that I have set there. We will talk about it right after the SSD. So for the SSD on the AAAWave frame, you guys can install it in a couple of different places. So I'm just choosing this place to install it for now because it's ideal. And then after you have it mounted properly, you want to go ahead and plug in your ports for your SSD. There are 2 different things that plug into your SSD, and they're both called SATA plugs. So the first SATA will transfer the data, which is the one that goes to your motherboard, and it's the smaller one. And then the other SATA cable is for your power, so that will be coming from your power supply. Now the first one you want to go ahead and connect is your SATA for the data, and for that on your motherboard you will have multiple different SATA ports, so you can just plug it into any of them, it doesn't matter at all. After you have your SATA connected to your SSD and motherboard, you can go ahead and also plug in your power button while you're at it as well to your motherboard. A lot of people seem to have troubles finding the power button there, and if you don't have a power button already, you can just order one online. They're very cheap and it's just about 2 pins shorting each other. So you can also turn it on with a screwdriver, and that's completely fine, but just to be more reliable, try to use an actual power button. Now to plug this power button, usually there in the bottom right of your motherboard there's a bunch of pins, and then the 3rd and 4th pin from the top left is usually the power switch pins, but please refer to your motherboard's manual to make sure that you're selecting the right pins. It does differ for every motherboard, and you want to make sure that you're actually shorting the right pins with the power button. It should say power switch on it or power on. So now we can go ahead and move on to the complex part of the build, and that is the power supplies. So in this video, we're going to be using the ParallelMiner power supply. They sent this to me and I'm really grateful for that. It's a really nice power supply. It came with 2 different breakout boards. One of the boards have 16 6 pins which plug into their specific cables for your GPUs or anything else you want to power with them. And then the other breakout boards also has a really good amount of 6 pins, and the best thing about it is that it also has the 24 pin CPU cable and different Molex as well as fan cables in there as well, which is really awesome. That means you don't need an ATX power supply at all, and you don't even need a standalone Pico adapter. This time it comes directly with the breakout board, and it honestly helps a lot. Now since we're using a server power supply, you might be using an ATX power supply, so it might be just a little bit different, but the instructions will remain the same. And if you're completely new to ATX power supplies or server power supplies, I have a video on both of these different power supplies on the channel, so you guys can feel free to check out those videos if you still have questions after this tutorial. So now the first thing I like to do when it comes to the power supplies is just plug in your essential things, so your CPU, your 24 pin on your motherboard, as well as your SATA connector for your SSD. So the 24 pin just plugs directly onto your motherboard, and you just want to make sure that everything you plug in actually clips in there. Try to avoid any loose connections because that can cause some damage later on. Now after you plug in your 24 pin, you want to go ahead and plug in your CPU cable, and that should be on the top left of your motherboard. And then you can also go ahead and plug in your SATA cable into your SSD. So now you have your essential things plugged in, and now what's left is your GPUs and your risers. Now if you also have some fans, then you can just plug into them a Molex cable, or you can plug them into the 4 pins on your motherboard or on your breakout board. Now it starts getting complicated when it comes to the GPUs and risers because you want to make sure that you properly distribute the power. And the issue with ATX power supplies is most of the time you will run short on power cables for your risers and GPUs. Now that is because you want to avoid using SATA for your risers because they can't supply enough power. The SATA will most likely burn out sooner or later, so just completely avoid it if you can. And as for Molex cables, you can power a riser with a Molex. You can at most do 2 risers per Molex, but it's still not the safe choice, so please try to avoid that as well. Now the best way to power your risers is through the 6 pin on the riser itself, and that should be powered from a 6-pin PCIe from your power supply. So the best way to start planning on this is to draft down everything you have and plan out your build. So let me show you how I planned out mine. Before we do that, let me just explain a couple of things that you guys might need to know before we talk about the strategy. So first, there's the 6-pin cables, and in this case, since I'm using a server power supply, these 6-pin cables are the ones that connect to the breakout board, and then they give me an 8-pin in return. So if you're using an ATX power supply, that will be your VGA cables. Usually you'll have 3 or 4 of them. You want to go ahead and check out online how many cables you have with that power supply so you can plan accordingly. And when it comes to server power supplies, you guys can always buy more cables to fit the amount of ports that you have on your breakout board, which means usually you'll never cut short using a server power supply, and now that's why I really like server power supplies. So other than the main cables, which are the PCIe cables, there are also the splitters. Now for splitters, you're most likely going to need them if you're trying to build out more than 3 GPUs. All they do for you is basically give you more pins to be able to fulfill all the GPUs that you need, as well as your risers. Now in this scenario, we're going to be using 6-pin to dual 8-pin splitters, but if you are working with high powered cards, then try to find 8-pin to dual 8-pin splitters. The more pins, the more power you can deliver with your cable. And also here's a couple more tips that you should keep in mind when it comes to this topic. First thing is, make sure you avoid powering 2 GPUs with the same cable. You will overload your cable and then you might end up burning it. The only time that you can try to do that is when you're using low powered cards, for example 1660 Ti's or 1660 Supers. They're really low powered cards, and it's fine to power 2 of those GPUs with a single cable using a splitter, or without using a splitter based on how many pins you need. Now one thing about splitters, you want to avoid daisy chaining them, so don't plug a splitter into another splitter. That's just going to open doors for more problems, so try to avoid doing that as well. And the third tip I would give you is try to power the riser and the GPU through the same power source. So for example, here we have 2 breakout boards, so I would try to power the GPU and the riser from the same breakout board, even though it's most likely fine with server power supplies to power them with different breakout boards. But this tip is specifically important if you're using more than 1 power supply. Try to make sure to power the GPU and its riser with the same power supply. Now as for your risers, you can try to fit maximum of 3 risers per cable. So if you have a dual 8-pin cable on your ATX power supply, don't try to put 4 risers on it, just put a max of 3 risers on it if you have to. Now I do show ways to use the ATX power supply cables as well in the ATX power supply guide that I will leave in the links below. So now that I clarified that, let's go ahead and talk about how I planned out my build. So first, I know that I have 12 GPUs, 6 RX 580s and 6 5700 XTs, and now from there I also know that I have 2 different breakout boards. So the goal is to build 6 RX 580s and their 6 risers on one board, and then the other 6 5700 XTs and the risers on the second board. So the main board, the one that's powering the CPU and the motherboard, will be the one that's powering the RX 580s. You guys don't need to specifically do it that way, I'm just doing it this way so I can be organized with the GPUs. So now for my RX 580s, I have 2 different models. So I have 3 cards that need double 8-pin, and then I have 3 cards that need a single 8-pin. And then of course there's the risers for each card, so that's another 6-pin. So now the way that I work with the 3 cards that have a single 8-pin, I power them with a single 6-pin cable that connects to a splitter, and then that splitter powers the 8-pin on the GPU and then the 6-pin on the riser. So that means I have one cable coming from the breakout board to power a GPU and its riser using a splitter. So I have 3 cards being powered this way, so that means I have 3 cables being used for 3 different GPUs. And then I also have the 6-pin cable connecting to a splitter, and then that splitter is connecting to the dual 8-pin on the dual 8-pin MSI GPUs. So that means I'll be able to power the dual 8-pin on the GPU through just one cable rather than having to use 2 of them. And then as for their risers, I used a 6-pin cable to a splitter to power 2 of the risers, and then I used a full 6-pin cable to the last riser, which is the third one. So that sums up my first board, which ended up being 8 cables and 7 different splitters. Now as for my second breakout board, which is the 5700 XTs, they all have dual 8 pins. So what I ended up doing is I ended up using 6 different cables, 2 splitters each, and then those splitters are powering a GPU each. So every cable is directly going to a splitter, and then from that splitter it's going to the GPU. So that means all the GPUs are now powered. What's missing is the risers. So for the risers I used 3 different cables, and those cables connect to a splitter, and then those splitters connect to 2 different risers. So each cable is connecting to a splitter, and then from there it's powering 2 different risers, and which ends up totaling for 6 different risers, and then from there the GPUs as well as the risers are completely powered. So now that wraps up the wiring for your power supply to your GPUs and risers. Now I hope you understand it better and know what exactly you're going to be doing. So now as for the placement for this server power supply, it's honestly huge and it's not going to fit on this frame. So I just have it hanging out a little bit on the side. I might be putting a box to support it later on, but that depends on how hot it gets. But so far it's looking good and it's not a trouble having it sitting like that. Now all in all, my feedback on this power supply, it's honestly a really good power supply. So if you guys want to get this power supply, you can find it on ParallelMiner.com. I will have the link for it in the descriptions below, so please feel free to check it out and get that power supply for yourself. And just remember that it only runs on 24 volt and it can also get pretty loud and hot. I will be playing a clip of the volume for the power supply once we finish this build. So after figuring out your cables, I usually like to prepare them before I put them on the frame. So I just plug in all the risers that I need and put all the splitters that I need as well. And then I will put up all the GPUs on the frame, and then from there I'll connect them each individually. Usually it's a lot easier to plug in your riser on the GPU before putting it on the frame, so make sure you keep that in mind and just try to do what's more comfortable for you. There is no wrong way here, so whichever order you want to do first, you can feel free to do it. Now just remember, on the risers, when you plug it into the GPU, you just want to align them properly so that the entire GPU just plugs into the riser nicely, and then you want to push that latch on the riser to make sure that the GPU is locked in there. Now after you have your GPUs and your risers in place and everything is mounted pretty well as your power supply, now you can move on to the USB part of the riser, which connects directly to your motherboard. Now hopefully you have that USB part already connected on the riser so you don't have to reach below the GPU. It can get really annoying. And then all you have left is just the other side of the riser, which is the X1 port that plugs into your PCIe slot on the motherboard. So now when it comes to the PCIe slots on your motherboard, you want to rank them first with the primary slots, and the primary slots are the larger ones. So whichever X16 slot that you see first, you want to go ahead and plug that first. Usually the GPU display will also come from the first large slot if you don't have integrated graphics. So now, like I mentioned, you first want to plug into the large slots. The first large slot will be the first, and then the second one will be the second one, and then etc. And then from there you'll have your smaller slots, and those smaller slots will be depending on your motherboard. So some motherboards have different orders for them, but generally it's all just starting from the first one and then moving on to the second one if there's one on the right, or the second one that's below it. Just make sure that you refer to your motherboard manual as well, because that information will be there as well. Now some motherboards have 19 slots, like the Asus B to 50 mining expert, and there's some motherboards with 13 slots, but that doesn't mean you can run any 19 or 13 GPUs. There are specific instructions for every motherboard, so make sure that you check their manual. For example, the 19 slots mining expert motherboard, you can only run on it 8 NVIDIA cards, or you can run on it 13 to 14 mixed of AMD and NVIDIA cards. And if you're planning on running full 19 cards, then you need mining dedicated cards. So like I said, make sure that you refer to the manual, it's going to be your best guide for this. So plugging in your riser into your motherboard, make sure you align it properly. You want that little notch to be pointing outwards where the USB ports are on the motherboard. If you do plug in the riser in the wrong orientation and then turn on your rig, you're most likely going to short the motherboard or your riser, and then you're going to burn one of them. So please be careful on this step, make sure that you plug it in the proper way. I myself messed up a lot of risers this way, so just don't do my mistake. So now hopefully you have all your risers plugged in, all your GPUs are all set, and now you've reached to a point where you're basically done with your rig. If you're planning on inserting some fans as well, you can feel free to do some fans. They can help with the temperature, but in my case I'm not doing any. And this frame also supports some fans, but the place that I live at doesn't get really hot, so I'm completely fine there. Now the most agonizing step of the process is cable management, so you want to go ahead and try to clean up your cables as much as possible. Now this isn't required, but it is recommended to make sure that you can avoid as much of the dust buildup as possible, and you can open up some clean airflow for the rig. Now after you have your cables organized, congratulations, you finished your mining rig build. It's basically it, it's not really complicated, it's really straightforward, and I hope you didn't have a lot of troubles along the way. So now this leaves two important steps in front of you. The first one is diving into your BIOS settings and changing the settings that need to be changed to make your rig work properly. Now this is usually not a required step, but in some scenarios you might need to change a couple of things in your BIOS to make sure that your rig runs properly. And then after you have that out of the way, you want to decide which mining software you want to use for your mining rig. So that means you can be running on Windows or a Linux operating system or anything that you want to use. Now since this video is just about building the rig, the next two videos will be exactly about that topic. So if you're watching this video 1 week from this video being posted, then the other two videos are most likely out already. So make sure that you check out the GPU mining guides playlist, and then you should be able to find them there. And then after watching those other two videos, if they're out, you should be good to go and mining without any issues. So now that wraps up the guide, guys. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I also want to thank you guys for breaking 50,000 subscribers. Like I promised you all, there's going to be a big giveaway, so I'm just waiting for the right video for it. Bear with me until then, and make sure to subscribe if you're not subscribed yet so you don't miss out this giveaway. I'm trying to make sure that as many people can win as possible in this giveaway, so there's going to be a lot of rewards. And if you also have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and if you have any feedback as well, I would love to hear your feedback. Thank you guys again, and if you enjoyed this video, leave a thumbs up, and I hope you have a wonderful day.